Hello class. Today I'm going to show you how to draw a one-point perspective grid. The purpose of drawing this grid is so that you can put an overlay, a piece of tracing paper over this grid to draw fairly accurately a one-point perspective of a room. Now normally you cannot really measure a perspective per se. However, with this grid you're able to use these squares here to measure lengths and distances to create a one-point perspective. The first thing that we'll do is draw a horizon line going across the middle of the page, then locate our one vanishing point, draw a plane across here that represents at quarter-inch scale the back of a wall. From this back of the wall, we're going to locate different points here in actual scale at quarter-inch scale of the width of that, which is 10 feet, and the height of that wall, which is 8 feet. You can see the different tick marks here representing the different feet. The vanishing point itself will be 3 feet off from the left side, 1, 2, 3 here, and 5 feet above the floor. You can see that in this perspective. There's a wall here, left wall, there's a right wall here, there's a ceiling at the top and a floor at the bottom. Now the reason why we have the horizon line at 5 feet above the floor line is that your normal height for a typical height person is 5 feet from their eye. So that's why we count 5 feet up. The reason why we have 8 feet is because the typical height of a residential space, say a bedroom or a living room, is 8 feet high. And I've chosen 10 feet for the width. That's about the width of a small bedroom. So that's why we have these dimensions. Another important point about this one-point perspective is that along the horizon line we have a diagonal point. Now the diagonal point is about the same distance as the width of the room. So that diagonal point measured here is about 10 or 12 feet. From that diagonal point, we're going to use that to create a diagonal line going across the room. And where it intersects with each of these lines here, we're going to start a horizontal grid of lines at each intersection. You'll see that when I construct the grid. Okay, great. Let's start drawing. What I have here is a blank sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11. I've taped it down. And when you draw, especially with tools, make sure that your drawing surface is flat and smooth. You don't want any textured surface. You want a really smooth surface. So something like a piece of plywood, maybe your dining room table. If you do have a table that has a rough surface, you can take a piece of board that you could buy at an art store. Make sure that it's a flat piece of board and tape it down on your dining room table, and you have a drawing surface that you could use. Now when I taped this down, I taped the sheet absolutely flat. I took drafting tape. Make sure it's drafting tape. If you don't have drafting tape, you can use painter's tape and tape the corners of this and make sure that it's lying flat. If you don't have a T-square, you can use 2 triangles to create these parallel lines and these lines in perspective. I've got 2 right here. I've got a 45-degree triangle. It has a 45-degree corner here, 45-degree corner here, 90-degree corner here. I've got a 30-60 triangle, 60 degrees here, 30 degrees here, and a right angle 90 degrees at both of these triangles. Now with both of these, you can put them together. For instance, you could have the 30-60 here and the 45 here, and as long as you hold that 30-60 degree triangle steady, you can actually draw parallel lines going down with your pencil or pen. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to put my 45-degree triangle off to the side. On the piece of paper, I'm going to make sure that it is up against that piece of paper. And I want to do that so I could create a perpendicular line going across. Make sure these corners are, again, taped really flat so you don't roll over them. So I've got that 90 degree perpendicular line in this direction. I'm going to take my pen. I'm going to use black felt tip pens here and draw a line perfectly across. Now you can see that I'm using a triangle that's at least 12 inches long so that I could span across this sheet of paper. So make sure you get big enough triangles in order to do that. Also make sure you get plastic triangles that are transparent so you can see what you're drawing underneath. I've got the horizontal line here. I'm going to locate my vanishing point. Locate the vanishing point. It could be arbitrary, but close to the middle. So I'm going to put it right over there. In that vanishing point, I'm going to use my scale. And again, I mentioned 1/4 inch scale. So I'm going to use my 1/4 inch architect scale. Turn that around. This is the 1/4 inch scale right here. It says 1/4 at the very end. I'm going to take that scale, and I wanted to measure 3 feet from the side. So I'm going to take my scale here, count off 1, 2, 3, and put a tick mark there. So I've got 3 feet off to the side. I'm going to draw a line. Again, to make sure everything is parallel, take your triangle, put it at the very bottom of the sheet. I know you can't see this, but I have this against the bottom of the sheet, and then take your 30-60 or whichever other triangle you're using, put it across here, and again make sure it lies flat on top of the other triangle so that you create a perpendicular angle, and just draw a very light line going across here. It wasn't dark enough. Let me do that again. What I like to do when I draw to tick marks is actually push my triangle up to that tick mark and then draw the line. Okay, nice dark line. Now I mentioned a height of 8 feet, and I mentioned 5 feet from the floor line. So again, I'm going to take my scale. I'm left-handed. If you're right-handed, you're going to use your right hand, and you're going to face the scale this way and mark off 5 feet. So there's 4 there, there's 5 there. That's 5 feet right there. And because I'm going to need these lines, I'm going to draw at each foot mark, 4 or 5. And then we can measure up. Remember, this room is 8 feet high. That's sort of the typical height of a residential space. So I've got 1, 2, 3, that's 8 feet. Perfect. Okay. Let's take our triangle again, put it off to the side. Make sure again it's parallel to our sheet of paper. And I'm going to draw a line at the top and the bottom. That's the top. That's the bottom. Okay, so this represents the height of our wall. Now I have to measure, I've measured 3 feet here. I have to measure another 7 feet here to get our 10-foot width. So let me take my scale. And you could either measure, you could either measure another 7 feet that direction or 10 feet from that line. In fact, what I'm going to do is measure 10 feet at the bottom because I'm going to need those tick marks to create the grid. So 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Perfect. Okay. Again, take your triangle, reposition them so that you have one at the bottom, and they're perpendicular to each other. I'm going to draw the rest of the box. Perfect. Now, when I draw, these are all construction lines, so I don't know exactly what the lengths are. The best thing to do is actually cross them so that you have an accurate point at the corners. So now I have the back wall. Now with that back wall, I can draw the two side walls and the ceiling and the floor by extending from the vanishing point out to each of these corners. And what that does is it creates actually the basic shape of the room. Two walls, the ceiling, and the floor. So let me go ahead and do that. And the length of these lines are somewhat arbitrary. I have an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper here. You could draw all the way to the edge of the sheet or close to it if you want to. So you line up the tick marks and create these diagonals. I've got vanishing point here, corner, and then out. Vanishing point here, corner, and then out. Notice that I'm not drawing all the way to the vanishing point. I'm drawing just to the corners that represent the corners of the wall, of the room, excuse me. Okay, vanishing point, corner, and out. And vanishing point, corner. Notice that I'm just putting the triangle just below the tick marks in the corner here. Perfect. Okay, let me darken a few of these lines up. Make sure that they're nice and even. Again, you have to be careful to make sure that these lines are parallel to each other. So butting up your triangle up against the edge of the piece of paper is a really good idea. I wouldn't trace them per se. Okay, that was maybe a little bit darker, maybe not. Okay, maybe. Right, so I've got a vanishing point here. I've got the ceiling, I've got the floor, and I've got the walls. Now, the reason why I'm having you actually put the vanishing point off to the left side a little bit is because you don't want to put the vanishing point right in the middle of your drawing. The reason why we're putting it off to the side is that if you put the vanishing point right in the middle, it focuses your eye on the middle of the drawing. And we want our viewers to see the whole drawing and not focus so much in the middle. The analogy is sort of like looking at a tunnel. If you're driving down a tunnel, your eye is focused right in the middle of the tunnel and right at the one vanishing point. If you put it off to the side, it allows your eye to kind of wander around and see the other parts of this drawing. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do now is draw a series of lines from the vanishing point to each of these tick marks at each of these measurements out outside the drawing. So let's go ahead and do that. So for the wall here, I'm going to create a horizontal grid using that vanishing point. So vanishing point, tick mark, vanishing point, tick mark, and the horizon line's already drawn, so I don't need to draw that. Vanishing point, tick mark, and vanishing point, tick mark, vanishing point. Again, I'm locating the vanishing point just underneath, or the triangle just underneath of that. And these lines that you're constructing should be light lines. So if you're using a pencil, you don't have to bear down as much. Now these represent the 8-foot height. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's going up or along the height of the wall. Now let's draw the lines on the floor. Vanishing point, tick mark, and out. Vanishing point, tick mark, and out. Vanishing point, tick mark, and out. There are more of these, so it's going to take a little bit longer. And be as accurate as you can. Having a sharp drawing instrument, good idea. Again, if you're using a pencil, make sure you're using a hard lead, like a 2H or an H. If you have a number 2 pencil, a yellow pencil, make sure it's really sharp. A number 2 pencil is really soft, so it'll dull right away. So make sure that you sharpen it often. Almost done here. Okay, great. Now you can see everything is all in one line weight. In other words, the darkness and the thickness of all of these lines are about the same. What I'm going to do is take a different pen that has a thicker line, and I want to emphasize the corners of the room. So this I'm going to trace. But again, I'm using parallel lines, so I'm going to make sure that my triangles butt up against the edge of the paper. And let me draw horizontal lines here. Ah, yes. Nice thick line. That's great. When I trace these lines, I try to just be off to the side with my triangles so that I'm tracing right on top of these lines. And again, retrace your steps, vanishing point, corner. Vanishing point, corner. Vanishing point, corner, and last line. Great. Now you see how much of a difference that is. Using the thicker pen, I'm able to outline the back wall and define both side walls, left and right, the ceiling and the floor, with these thicker lines. So the line weight really is an important thing to use. Cool, I've got all my lines emanating from the vantage point. Now I need to locate the diagonal point to start my grid. So the diagonal point is going to be off to the right-hand side. And as I mentioned, it'll be about the same width of the room. I'm going to make it a little bit longer, so the room is 10 feet again. I'm going to, from that line here, from the corner of the room, I'm going to make it about 10 feet, or I'm sorry, 12 feet. So let me take my scale again, take my pen. Make sure when you're using these felted pens that you put the caps back on so that they don't dry out. If you leave them out overnight, they'll dry out and you won't have the ink anymore. So I'm measuring 12 feet. Great. That's my diagonal point. Okay, now the important move here is once I locate this diagonal point, I'm going to draw a diagonal line. That's why it's called a diagonal point. From the diagonal point to the corner and out towards the left wall here. So let me do that. Diagonal point, the bottom corner of that wall right there, and make sure you're a little bit underneath. I'm going to draw it from the diagonal out here and across. Okay, important point to have. So I've located the diagonal point again, 12 feet from that wall, the edge of the wall, the corner there, to the bottom corner of that wall. Now, every time this diagonal line hits one of these lines here, I'm going to draw a horizontal line. And that's going to represent a grid on the floor. And the grid is not an equal grid. In fact, the grid will be wider in the front and then narrower in the back. You'll see what I mean when I draw this. So let me, again, put my triangle up against the edge here. Again, it's a series of parallel lines. I'm going to start, actually, let's start with the bottom line here. So diagonal, I'm hitting the corner there. I'm going to draw a light line across. Move the triangle up. Again, I've got a line emanating from the vanishing point. Draw a line across. And notice that I'm not stopping. I'm actually crossing lines. I think that is a much more accurate way of drawing to see the intersection of things. Just be very careful that you draw at the right intersection. You don't want to confuse yourself. Notice how these lines are just getting narrower and narrower. That's part of the rules of perspective, is that things get smaller as they recede in perspective, whether it's a 2-point perspective or whether it's a 1-point perspective. I think drawing from the bottom up actually makes it a little bit more clearer and gives you practice so that you could be really accurate at the very back here. Wonderful. Okay. You can see the definition of the floor and the floor grid. Yeah, it almost looks like a tiled floor, right? Right. So I have the floor grid. I could locate things on the grid by counting squares. So if I wanted to draw, say, a bed 2 feet from this wall here, I could count 2 grids over. And if I wanted the bed to be 5 feet long, I could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that would be the start of my drawing of the bed. And that's how you would use a floor grid. Now, everything has heights, so we'll need to also draw a grid with heights going up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to use these intersections of the corner of the wall where the left wall meets the floor and draw lines going straight up that will represent the feet coming away from the back wall. So let me go ahead and do that. Again, put your triangle up to the bottom here. And I'm going to start from the front and work my way back. Seems to be easier that way. And what I'm drawing is I'm drawing the height of the wall, which is 8 feet. That represents 8 feet. And again, I'm using the intersections at the bottom here for each increment of the grid. And again, I'm crossing lines. Just be very careful when you do this, especially with a pen. You want to make sure that each line is pretty much correct. For me, it helps wearing my glasses, actually. Notice how it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, especially along the wall. Great. Okay, so for each line that crosses here, I should have a line going up. That looks like the case. It gets a little bit more crazy towards the end over there. Okay, hopefully you'll do a much more accurate job than I will. Great. So this is the perspective grid. Let me label everything here so that you know what things are. So the vanishing point is here. I'll label that VP. The diagonal point is here. The back wall's here. Floor is here. The right wall is here. The left wall is here. And the ceiling is here. Great. Okay, so how do you use this grid? Let me show you. You can do, or you can draw overlays on top of this. So what I did was, I had drawn this grid before. Take a piece of trace paper, and this is already drawn, so that's why you see this drawing done already. Put the trace over, and then you can trace the wall lines, the ceiling lines. You could measure up the grid to get the sill height of the windows and measure up the grid again to get the window heights. And then use the floor grid to actually elevate lines up to get accurate measurements. So the back wall is actually measured at 1/4 inch scale. That's really the only thing or the only element of the drawing, the back wall, where you could actually measure things. Then everything else you have to use the grid. So if I have this bed here, I count 2 grids over. If it's 2 feet away from the wall, if it's 5 feet long, I could count 5 grids going across up until the back wall, and I could draw the bed on the floor, then elevate it up. When I elevate the bed up, I could count grids going up. So along here, that would be 1, 2, or 1.5, and then I could draw a line across, and that's how I would construct that. Great. So draw this grid, and hopefully you could reuse this grid if you've got other assignments in order to draw a 1-point perspective. Thanks.